Welcome to the Plagues Project.
10 Plagues, Many Angles.
Now more than ever.
Come learn with us.
The recitation of the 10 plagues is one of the most dramatic moments during the Passover Seder, and so it's not surprising that it produced a very rich visual tradition. As we count out the 10 plagues inflicted upon the land of Egypt, blood, frogs, lice, wild animals, pestilence, boils, hail, locust, darkness, and finally, the death of the firstborn. A drop of wine is spilled out for each plague to remember the suffering of the Egyptians. As it says in Proverbs 24:17, when your enemy falls, do not rejoice. The text of the Hagaddah hasn't changed for over 1,000 years, but the images used to illustrate it have transformed in response to the times and places in which they were created. By looking at how the plagues were depicted in illustrated Haggadot, we can see the two major dynamics of Judaism, tradition and adaptation. In the midst of a pandemic, these images take on a new resonance. From the 13th century onwards, Haggadot added imagery to the text, not only to delight and engage the eye, but more importantly, to create additional layers of meaning and understanding to the text. The images illustrated biblical text and commentary, and are also evidence of how Jewish communities interacted with their wider cultures and integrated their surroundings into their ritual practice. So let's look at three important periods of Hebrew book production: the medieval era, the age of printing, and the 18th century Hebrew manuscript revival, and we can dip our fingers into some of the remarkable depictions of the 10 plagues. The Ryland's Hagaddah is a Spanish illuminated manuscript from the mid-14th century. Like other Sephardic illuminated Haggadot of the period, the text of the Haggadah is preceded by a series of miniature illustrations that include depictions of each of the plagues. So on this page, we're looking at the plague of boils. And as you can see in the architecture, in the border and the background decoration, and the distinctly non-Egyptian clothing, the artist was using the same vocabulary as contemporary Christian art. The crowned pharaoh has his two magicians next to him, and Moses and Aaron are standing at center. It's interesting to note that Moses doesn't appear anywhere in the entire text of the Haggadah, but in these miniature illustrations, Moses is brought back as a central figure into the story, reinforcing his role as a representative for God's intention. Artists used the fragmentary structure of the Haggadah to make explicit both the physicality of the plagues as well as their divine origins. Standing before the boil-covered bodies of the Egyptians and their livestock, the figure of Moses and Aaron are pointing towards the heavens, reminding Pharaoh and the viewer that the plagues are not a phenomenon of the natural world or from man-made magic, but were a divine communication outside the natural or social order. In the Golden Hagaddah, produced in Catalonia in the early 14th century, the text is preceded by a cycle of 14 full-page miniatures illustrating 71 scenes from the Bible, including the 10 plagues. The illustration for the plague of Arov, following the commentary in the Midrash of Rabbi Yehuda, who says that it was a mixed assortment of wild animals. So here it's translated visually from top to bottom as a squirrel, a dog, a lion, a wolf, and a griffin. Latin manuscripts used the Greek translation of the Bible and depicted this plague as a swarm of flies. At right, you can see the plague of frogs, and at left, the plague of lice, illustrating the passages from Exodus in which Aaron strikes the dust of the earth, which transformed into vermin infesting the land of Egypt. Inside this Gothic architecture at left, you can see figures combing out their hair with double-sided combs, which were usually made out of bone and typical of the time. Manuscripts were only accessible to a very small percentage of the population, and producing illuminated and illustrated manuscripts was a very involved and expensive process that was reserved for the few who could afford it. But the advent of printing changed everything. The introduction of movable type by Johannes Gutenberg in the mid-15th century offered unprecedented access to books and to images. The beginning of Hebrew printing around 1470 ushered in a new era in Jewish life and also created a new market. The Hagaddah recited in Jewish homes around the world was an obvious choice for early Hebrew printers. And so what was once strictly an oral tradition and then became, with illuminated manuscripts, a luxury object reserved for the few, was suddenly accessible to a much larger audience. And not only could every household have their own Hagaddah, but eventually every person at the Seder could potentially have access to a wide range of images and visual interpretations of the plagues. These are 2 pages from the earliest known illustrated printed Hagaddah. It was printed in Constantinople around 1506 and discovered in the Cairo Geniza. Although no complete edition exists, there are multiple pages from different copies in the collections of the Library of the Jewish Theological Seminary and the Cambridge University Library. The woodcut image at right shows 4 men at a Seder, and you can see this figure is holding his own Hagaddah. At left, you have the plague of lice, kinim, which is integrated into the text, so that the owner of the book would be looking at the plague image as he or she was reading the Hagaddah at the Seder. Here you can see Pharaoh is at right in a turban. The clothing and the architecture in this image are distinctly Italian in style. Like the Spanish illuminated manuscript Haggadah, the scene is set in a decorative border and architecture is used to divide up the space. The additional figures may be Pharaoh's magicians who attempt to replicate the plague with their spells, but could not. And as the text in Exodus says, the vermin remained on man and beast. In the 16th and 17th centuries, Hebrew printing flourished, as did illustrated printed Haggadot, and there were several important editions that created influential models. The Venice Haggadah, printed in 1609, included detailed woodcut images of the plagues gathered together on 1 page for the first time. And here you can see, appropriate to the page, are very old wine stains. On either side, you have commentary and instructions in Judeo-Italian, Ladino, or Judeo-German, depending on the edition. The Venice Haggadah also included this remarkable image in which the depictions of the plagues is less literal and places an even greater emphasis on the supernatural origin of the plagues. The caption in Ladino reads, that's right down here. The caption in Ladino reads, demons delegated over the elements to give Egypt afflictions and torments. The imagery is derived from the commentary on Psalm 78:49, which reads, he inflicted his burning anger upon them, wrath, indignation, trouble, a band of deadly messengers. The Midrash specifies that these messengers were demons. In the 17th century, Amsterdam was the center of Hebrew printing. The Amsterdam Hagaddah, published in 1695, influenced all future editions of the Hagaddah. It had a very sharp, distinctive layout and an elaborate series of illustrations, which was produced for the first time ever with copperplate engraving. The engravings were created by the artist Abraham Bar Jacob, who was a pastor from Germany who converted to Judaism and came to Amsterdam when he was 26 years old. It was reprinted in 1712 with the 10 plagues set together in this format. The Amsterdam Hagaddah was disseminated throughout Europe, and its layout and its imagery remained popular for hundreds of years. In the early 18th century, a Hebrew manuscript revival made what was old new again. 300 years after the advent of printing and long after the decline of handmade illuminated books, court Jews in German-speaking lands began to commission luxurious Hebrew manuscripts for personal use. Creating a manuscript was time-consuming and expensive, and materials like parchment and ink had to be produced by hand. In the era when one could buy a printed Hagaddah at a nominal cost, it's remarkable that handwritten and hand-drawn manuscripts on parchment were commissioned. The scribe artists who created these manuscripts used the Amsterdam Hagaddah as a model. This Hagaddah was created by the scribe artist Joseph ben David of Leipnich in Darmstadt in 1734. And you can see how closely linked it is to the Amsterdam Hagaddah. What's most notable about these manuscripts from the 18th century isn't what they copied from, but what they changed. If we look closely at the details of the miniatures of the plagues, we can see that the dress and architectural settings are those of court Jews and were adapted to reflect their own lives and their experiences and their aspirations. Images were a powerful way to connect the ancient story of suffering and redemption to contemporary conditions. As the Hagaddah instructs us, in every generation, a person is obligated to view themselves as if he or she were the one who was delivered from Egypt.